Welcome. I'm Heather Nancurrow, Director of the Queensland Centre for Domestic and Family Violence Research at CQ University, Australia. I wish to acknowledge the Yubira people, the traditional custodians of the land on which our centre is located. I pay my respects to their elders past and present. The Queensland Centre for Domestic and Family Violence Research is jointly funded by CQ University and the Queensland Government to undertake research, evaluation, sector development and community engagement on domestic and family violence matters. Convening research seminars is a key initiative of the Centre within its sector development and community engagement functions. These seminars enable researchers to present their findings to practitioners, and together they can explore the implications for policy and practice. The seminars are generally broadcast to audiences around the state of Queensland via video conferencing. They are also recorded for the production of DVDs, such as this one, which enable further distribution of relevant research findings. On behalf of the Centre, I would like to thank CQ University and the Queensland Government for the funding that has made this seminar and DVD possible. I hope that you find the contents interesting and useful. It's now my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Jane Ursel. Do you want to come over, Jane? And I'll just give you a little bit of background. Many of you will already know of Professor Jane Ursel and her work. Jane is a Professor of Sociology at the University of Manitoba in Canada and is the Principal Investigator on two longitudinal studies. First, the Winnipeg Family Violence Court Project, now in its 20th year of operation, which collects data on all persons accused of family violence offences in the city and currently has a data set over 30,000 cases. And the second project is the longitudinal study entitled The Healing Journey, and that's the subject of Jane's presentation today. Jane is also the Director of Resolve, Research and Education for Solutions to Violence and Abuse, and a tri-provincial research network with offices at the Universities of Manitoba, Regina and Calgary. This is Jane's second visit to the Queensland Centre for Domestic and Family Violence Research. She was first here in April 2004, so almost exactly 7 years ago. It's great to have you back, Jane. We're really looking forward to hearing your presentation today, and we'll, as I said earlier, be able to provide details of this on the CIDFA website and make a DVD available with your blessing, so thank you very much for that. So please join me in welcoming Jane back to CIDFA and for her presentation here today. Thank you. Yes, you can.
Thank you very much, Heather. It's an absolute pleasure to be back in Queensland, and particularly Mackay. It's a beautiful country and it's always wonderful to come here. I am very pleased to have this opportunity to share some preliminary results from a research project that we have ongoing in Canada, and I look forward to your questions. I'm going to probably whip through the slides fairly quickly because I think the best part of a presentation is the discussion that follows. So if you have any questions about the particular slides, if there's something you don't understand, if you could jot that down, I'll do my best to be able to answer it. Okay, so I'm just, before we start going through the slides, I would just like to tell you a little bit about the partnership between the community of service providers and the university, because without the social service agencies, this study never could have occurred. And I will go through briefly the various roles that our community partners, who were service providers, played in the construction of this study, because their role was so critical. First of all, before we actually began interviewing women, we had 18 months to develop relevant questions to ask them, which we did in partnership with service providers and experiential women. And when I use the term experiential women, I mean women who have themselves been victims of domestic violence. We developed 5 questionnaires, one that gave us the history and demography of the women, just to give us a baseline. Another one who looked at the services that they utilized and how they felt they were, getting along on a day-to-day basis. We asked them, we had a combined questionnaire called Health and Parenting, where we asked them a series of questions on their health, especially as a result of the abuse that they'd experienced, and also the challenges of parenting when they were dealing with domestic violence cases and their own recovery process. And finally, we had a questionnaire done, which I'm very excited about. It was called it doesn't sound exciting, it's the Income and Employment Questionnaire. But we have a magnificent feminist economist who's working with us, and what we will get out of that particular set of data is an estimate of the costs of domestic violence. And we have found that to be extremely valuable when service agencies lobby government for more money, more programs, because the costs, as you all know, if you are service providers, the cost of domestic violence is horrendous. It's expensive to the system, but it is incredibly horrendous and expensive to the families who are involved in the process. So in addition to working with community partners to develop the questions and to make sure we were asking the questions that would be relevant to them in terms of policy and program development, we had those 5 working groups that helped develop the questionnaires. In addition, we had 6 working groups, 2 per province, because this study occurred in 3 different provinces in Canada. And what the purpose of these working groups were to have focus groups with both service providers in the 3 provinces and also with experiential women, to ask them questions about how should we structure the study, how can we attract people to participate in it, and importantly, how can we keep them in the study, because we wanted to interview them 7 times over 4.5 years, approximately every 6 months. And so we did focus groups with, we did 26 focus groups in 9 communities across the 3 provinces. We interviewed 186 women, 102 of them were experiential, and 84 were service providers. We then pilot tested the questions, and once we felt that we were ready to go, hired our interviewers, we then began the recruitment. Now, our community partners were absolutely critical in this process. We were formally partnered with 3 shelter associations with each of the 3 one in each of the 3 provinces, and that provided us with resources in 35 shelters across the 3 provinces. In addition, we also partnered with a wide range of service providers who provided non-residential counseling, second stage housing, and a whole range of other services specific to domestic violence. And they provided us with the following service. They provided the recruitment sites. We would go to a shelter or an agency, we would host a lunch or a coffee party and invite their staff and their clients to come, and we would talk about the study and encourage them to sign up. So we did the recruitment in agencies. Once we had recruited the sample that we needed, we conducted our interviews in the agencies because safety was critical. And what the service providers did was provide us a safe place to conduct the interviews. The other thing that was absolutely critical about locating the interviews in these agencies was if, in the process of the interview, a woman had a bad experience, needed some help right away, each of these agencies we worked with provided a counselor who could come in. We would terminate the interview, and the counselor would come in and deal with the woman's issues, her concerns, or her, thinking about the past that was making her very upset. And finally, our community partners were absolutely critical in retention. When you do longitudinal studies, one of the biggest problems is losing your sample before you've completed your study. And so when we recruited women, we asked each of the women to give us the name of 3 or 4 people whom we had permission to contact if we couldn't find the women. And the agencies, many of the women gave us the name of the agency director or their specific counselor at the agency. And this was invaluable for us, locating women who had kind of fallen out of our contact list of phone number, address, etc. And the agencies were critical in helping to locate these women. The inclusion, so the sample for this study was purposeful. The goal of the study was to get information on program and policies. What was it about women's trajectory as they were on their healing journey that was helpful, and what was an impediment? And so we purposefully wanted to access women who were using services so we could then give the information back to the service. So it was a purposeful sample of people who were using services. We also specifically recruited for women with disabilities. We recruited specifically for lesbian women and immigrant women because these are often groups that their voice doesn't get heard. The last thing I'll say about the study before I begin to look at the data, which I'm sure is what you're interested in, is we made a conscious attempt to match the interviewer with the interviewee, the person who participated in the study. So if we were interviewing Aboriginal women, they had an Aboriginal interviewer. If we were interviewing women with disabilities, they had an interviewer who was a woman with disabilities. And we tried very hard to match that up so that women felt comfortable and over time developed a relationship with the person who was interviewing them, so it wasn't stressful or foreign, or they didn't have to tell their story all over again. Okay, so if we look now at the data, what you will see is in the 3 provinces, we recruited a little over 200 women in each province, and we tried to get a mix of city, small town and rural, or northern. And, you know, different provinces had various degrees of success. Interviewing northern people was always most challenging because often they live in remote communities, and just getting in touch with them and staying in touch with them was a real challenge. Overall, we recruited 665 women to participate in the study. What I'm going to do first is give you a bit of data on the characteristics of the women. Then we'll look at their abuse experiences, and then we'll look at their experiences specifically of using the legal services and their opinions of the legal services. Okay, here's the demographics. Our group ranged in age from 18 to 80 years of age, but the average was about 36 years old. 91% of the women had children, and 15% had large families of 5 or more children. One of the things that stands out is the incredibly low income that our participants had. This was an artifact of how we sampled, because the people who use the free abuse-specific services are often using them because they have no other source of support. So having access to free services, by definition, gave us a window into the lives of women who were very disadvantaged. Now, not all women were. While that was the average, we had women whose incomes ranged from $15,000 or less to over $100,000 or more. But the bulk of the women were women who were really challenged with having low income. 43% had less than a high school education. Again, disadvantaged people who were accessing these services. Because of the way we recruited, the one demographic point that I forgot to put on my slide was that 50% of our sample were Aboriginal women. Again, this is a function of how we sampled. In our province, in Manitoba, our shelter directors told us that 70% of the women in the shelter are Aboriginal women. So we had a significant representation. 50% of our sample were women of Aboriginal origin. One of the things that we were concerned about is the disadvantages that women experience, both in education and in income. And so we had a series of questions about how their partner played a role in creating that disadvantage and therefore creating that dependency on him. We found that a very significant number had their partners interfere with work. Partners would come and harass women at their workplace. Some partners refused to let her work, and significantly, over 60% had partners who interfered with their education. Because I'm a professor and I teach at my home university, I have many times, almost every year, had an experience of having a number of Aboriginal women who are students in my classes who show up very distraught because when they went home for the weekend, their partner took all their books, all their notes, all their essays and burnt them. So there are, as you probably all know, procedures that their partners go to try to keep them dependent on them and try to block their independence. Okay, so that was a huge issue, was the difficulties that women had in terms of their income. The earlier slide showed how their partner tried to block their independence. Despite this, what we found was a significant number were employed, about a third to 40%, and a significant number were currently students. And if you added those two up, because often women were both part-time employed and students, we found that over half of our sample were women on a journey to become better educated and employed so that they could provide for their children on their own. One of the questions that we asked in the history and demography section was, we were looking at the intergenerational patterns of abuse. And so one of the first questions we looked at was, how many of our participants experienced disruptions in their childhood? And you can see that a very significant number, far more in Manitoba, my home province, than the other provinces, had experienced a foster home placement at least once, sometimes more, in their childhood. They had other child welfare interventions. Again, a very significant, if you add those two up, it begins to become very significant in numbers. And between 36 and 50% of our participants reported that as a child they had to leave the home with their mother because of violence occurring in the household. We then asked them about witnessing violence in their childhood. We asked them about their own experience. We also asked them about their partner's experience. And then we asked them about their mother and father's experience. Now, when it came to their partner, 80% of the women could answer these questions. They knew quite a bit about their partner's history. However, when it came to their mothers, about 75% of the women could answer those questions and tell you about their mother's history and experience. And when it came to the father, it was a little over 50%, 54%. So these percentages you see are based on women who said, yes, they had knowledge of their parents' or partners' prior history around issues of violence. And what we find is that it's interesting that it was particularly high for the partners, that there was a history of violence, witnessing violence in their childhood. It was also over 50% for the participant, the women who were in the study. About between 30 and 35% for the mothers, and a lower percentage, 22 to approximately 30%, knew that their fathers had witnessed violence in their childhood. So what we're finding in this study is a lot of verification of what service providers have been telling us for years. And what we're able to do is provide them with the hard data, so when they lobby for various programs that attempt to respond to these kinds of challenges, they can present data that may be a little more respected, unfortunately, by government officials than anecdotal information. The experience of childhood physical and sexual abuse, rather than witnessing violence, actually being a victim of violence, we found that it was very high among participants. Between 68 and 76% of participants had experienced either childhood physical or sexual abuse. Their partners was also very high, over 50% and up to 65%. Mothers around the level of 40%, and fathers again 24 to 26%. We then asked specifically the nature of the abuse that the participants, the women in our study, experienced, and we see an extraordinary high level. Between 51 and 65% had experienced physical abuse as a child. Between almost 50 to 60% had been sexually abused as a child, and then very high percentages had experienced emotional abuse. A smaller group reported neglect, and again, a very high percentage, over 50% to 63%, had witnessed violence. We then asked them about their experience with their partner. Now, we have a huge amount of data, and I'm just giving you some highlights because we've only begun to mine the data at this point. We found, as service providers have been telling us for a very long time, that about 3/4 of the women were abused when they were pregnant. We found that a very high percentage, almost in the 40%, during the abuse, at least one or more times, their partner had used a weapon. And we also found that between 38 and 44% of the women reported that at least once, and often more, sexual assault was part of the abuse incident. And what we found overall, we had a very detailed, complex abuse scale. And what's very interesting, and it's not the subject of this presentation, but I did a presentation talking about the differences between the women in the 3 provinces. And there are some substantial differences between the income and the history of women in the 3 provinces. But when it comes to abuse, it's like the great leveler. They all had the same experiences, which is very telling and moving. So it's not something that only poor women experience. It is an incredible leveler. Once you've been an abused woman, the stories that they tell were remarkably similar. We then have a whole series of questions on the health impacts of their abuse. We asked them about their health as a result of childhood abuse, and then as a result of their current partner abuse. And what you see is that their experiences of disabilities was greater from their partner abuse, although it ranged dramatically from 9 to 33%. The disabilities they experienced from childhood abuse were not as pronounced, but overall, between 30 and 39% of the women in our study reported long-term illness or disability as a result of their abuse, either as a child or as an adult. And 1/3 of the women, between 27 and 33% of the women, reported that they had tried to commit suicide 1 or more times. So the health impacts are absolutely dramatic. Now I'm going to talk a bit about the services that they've used, and then we'll go on to looking at some of their experiences specifically with the legal system. Because the women had low incomes, a very high percentage were using social assistance. You can see the powerful argument we'll be able to make to our respective governments about the cost of intimate partner violence. Between 39 and 70% of the women have used social housing. Now, the differences between the province on the social housing issue, I think, just reflects the differences in the amount of social housing stock that's available in those 3 provinces. Manitoba tends to have more than the other 2 provinces. We then asked them about their utilization of abuse-specific services. A very high percentage of women, between 54 and 73%, used shelters 1 or more times. Often, we had women report having used shelters 10 times or more. So it was a very critical service in their lives. Between 12 and 35% of the women used second stage housing. I don't know whether you have second stage housing in Australia. You do. It's a longer term stay. We have apartments. Women move in with their children. They live independently in those apartments, but there's a special a floor, usually in a social housing unit, and one of the apartments is a counseling center. So they live independently, but they're right next door to their counselors, and they live with other women who are going through more difficult transitions to independence and a violence-free life. A huge number called the crisis line, and almost all the women were in between 84 and 89% had accessed counseling of one sort or another. We then get to legal services, and I know that this is a very controversial area, and there's a lot of debates on the pros and cons of legal intervention and criminalization. So we were very interested in these women's experiences. Almost all, between 72 and 83% of the women had been involved with the police. Either the overwhelming majority had called the police themselves, but they also had family who had called the police, children, sometimes neighbors. About half of them had been to criminal court. Now, one of the differences, I think, in Canada as opposed to Queensland at least, is that when a woman calls the police because there's a domestic violence incident, the police arrest the offender or the accused. They don't get a protection order, they arrest him, and he goes to criminal court. So in our jurisdiction, the only person who can apply for a protection order is the person who wants it. So now they can ask for police assistance or lawyer's assistance, but it is typically the woman herself who requests the protection order, and she can have someone to assist her in the application. Just to give you an idea of the relative differences, in the city that I live, where there are about 700,000 people, we have approximately 2,500 arrests, where the man will go through the criminal justice system right away. The accused, which is more frequently a man, I should clarify. And about 1,200 people apply for protection orders. So the criminal justice route is the more typical route in Canada when a woman calls the police. The no contact orders, this could come in a variety of ways. It could come as a result of the applicant applying for a protection order. It could come as a result of the offender is arrested and he's released on his own recognizance with a series of conditions. The police can impose conditions, and typically it's no contact, no communication. Or if he's arrested and he has to wait in jail until he gets bail, again, the court can issue no contact, no communication orders. We found in earlier studies that women were not always clear about whether it was a civil order, a protection order, or an order through the courts from bail or from police orders. So we just used a general term, no contact orders, because everyone knew if their partner had been issued an order of some sort not to have contact or communication with him. And then, of course, almost half, 40 to 46%, were involved in family law proceedings, divorce, custody, support issues. We then asked women, since there was such a heavy engagement with the criminal justice system, we asked them about their partner's history. Had he ever been arrested? Well, between 76 and 82% had been arrested in the past. Had he ever been convicted? Between 64 and 68% had been convicted of a crime in the past. Had they been arrested for IPV, interpersonal violence? Over half. Had they been convicted? Less than half. And then we asked them, have they been arrested for a particular assault against you? And the number goes down to about 15 to 20%. And then were they ever convicted of an assault on you? And the number drops to about 12 to 14%. So roughly half of the people who are arrested end up being convicted. And one of the reasons that is the case is if it's a first-time offense and the woman is reluctant to testify, the accused will not plead guilty. If there's feeling by the Crown prosecutor that they could divert the case, what they will do is they will hold the charges and they will delay the case in court, and they will give the accused the option to attend, participate, and complete a batterer's treatment program. If he does that, he will, the Crown, if the Crown attorney, the prosecutor, then gets a note from the counseling agency that he has fulfilled that obligation, then the charges will be stayed. So every year, at least 10% of the people that are arrested end up in the diversion program. Okay, one of the things that's interesting about doing both research with women telling their own stories, and then I also, through the Family Violence Court, I do research with the formal data. And I was struck by the difference between what the women were telling us and what the formal data was showing us. Around 41% of the women, if we look at all 3 provinces, experienced rape during their assaults, once or more during their assaults. If we look at the Winnipeg Family Violence Court, that's the next column, that's where I do my data collection, only 1% of the charges were for sexual assault in an intimate partner violence case. And then I thought, well, maybe there's something unique about our court. So I looked at the Canadian criminal justice statistics, and I found that they reported only 2%. I then looked at the issue of assault with a weapon. Again, a very high incident women were reporting. But when you looked at the official statistics, only 15% of the charges dealt with assault with a weapon. And if you looked at the national statistics, only 12%. So one of the things I'm very excited about in terms of potential for this study is going to ministers of justice and other policymakers and saying, look at the gap. What are we missing here? And how can we bridge that gap? And yes, of course, obviously sometimes it will be women's decision not to report it, and that should be absolutely respected. But are police missing something in the evidence? Are the Crown attorneys and the victim service people making it difficult for women to disclose a sexual assault? Okay, so quickly, very quickly, because I'm running out of time, we then asked women what they thought of the police response. And I broke it down between our Aboriginal and our non-Aboriginal women, because in Canada, our Aboriginal people, as in Australia, have a terrible history of colonization and racism and repression. And police often played a central role in that. So the concern was that Aboriginal people would be less likely to seek out assistance from the criminal justice system. So we were concerned about the women's experience by their ethnicity. What's very interesting is that while Aboriginal women are less positive, they're also less negative. And so we then, and then a number of them gave us mixed information about, well, they were helpful, but I didn't like this. And some just simply gave factual information. They came, they arrested him, he was removed, and they asked if I wanted to go to the hospital, or they took me to the hospital, something like that. Very, just factual. How were you treated by the prosecutor? Now you'll notice the numbers are smaller because I'm just reporting on the Manitoba women at this point, because we have a specialized domestic violence court and we wanted to find out what their experience was about that. Aboriginal women were much more positive, to our amazement. We were very surprised about how they were treated by the prosecutors than were non-Aboriginal women, and of course much less negative. Non-Aboriginal women were much more ambivalent. There's a lot more mixed responses from the non-Aboriginal women. How were you treated by the judges? Again, Aboriginal women were much more positive than non-Aboriginal women. And again, Aboriginal non-Aboriginal women were, I would say, quite conflicted. You know, they would see positive parts, but also negative. They had, while we have the data, we also have narratives, so that they have an opportunity to tell us in detail, and we haven't done that qualitative data analysis yet, but I think it will be very rich in understanding what the expectations of the different groups of women were and how that led to their reactions. So I'm now just going to end on 2 slides, because I know my time is running out. Why is this research important? Well, look at the data. We had a journalist in Canada who looked at all of the persons who were police officers and soldiers who were killed between 2000 and 2006, and he compared it to the domestic homicide rate, women being killed by their male partners. And he compared Canada and the United States. The ratio of women being killed relative to police officers and soldiers in Canada is 5 to 1. The ratio in the USA is 2 to 1. And all during this period, Canada was heavily involved in the war in Afghanistan. I think this is really important because every time a soldier is killed, it is national news. Every time a woman is killed, we may only hear about it in our local newspaper, and it certainly never is front page news. So it's important to get this data out because women are dying at a much greater rate than soldiers and police officers. And yet our public doesn't seem to always realize this. And I think that's very important. And my last slide is, while there are domestic homicides, programs can reduce that. Before 1993, when all of the specialist programs were brought in Manitoba, our province of Manitoba had the horrible distinction of being the domestic homicide capital of the country. More partners were being killed than anywhere else in the country. So I then asked Stats Canada to do a run for us, comparing our province with the other provinces after all of our specialist programs were introduced. And what we found was that our domestic homicide rate dropped to the lowest in Western Canada and the 3rd lowest in the entire country. So there is some considerable evidence that if you provide the programming, if you facilitate women's access to the services, that you can save lives. And you can help women transition from dangerous, crisis-ridden families to healthy, violence-free families. Thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions?
Yes, sounds Jane University. I found in Lower Farmline and Townsville and Fiji and City Island, I find that so many times it is a well-meaning discipline of very good parents that teach children to be very violently wrong. This is one thing I spoke about in Fiji just recently, that I saw a mother disciplining a son, and that son, the older brother, is quite violent with his wife at the moment. That I did have an opportunity to speak with a mother of these 2 boys, but I do find that sometimes our Christian ethics of disciplining children can be a very good way of just teaching them to be violent later on in life.
Thank you. Did everybody hear? Oh, did the people at the other sites hear the question? Are we okay? And I'll just repeat it briefly, and that was, are there ways in which parents are disciplining their children that actually contribute to their young boys growing up to be men who are violent? And I think you made a really excellent point. When we look at the whole history of violence against women, it's so complicated. It has to do with their family background. It has to do with our culture that glorifies violence, our video games. It's a very, very complex cultural mix of very bad messages, I think, in terms of might makes right. And I think this is why I've been collecting this data now, especially the court data, for 20 years. And one of the things people say is, well, why hasn't it gone down? You know, why haven't you eliminated it by now? And of course, the question is, it permeates so many of our institutions that we really need all of the institutions to play a role in confronting that. And so unfortunately, I think we're looking at many generations before we can see an end to this cycle of violence. Thank you for that question or comment. One thing I might just add on to that before, if there are no other questions, is one of having interviewed so many women, one of the things that they report, which I think is so powerful, is when they were able to find a safe, nonviolent relationship. They would report with such pride and such honor that their sons were growing up to be gentle, kind men. I mean, that was incredibly important to these women. And that's why the journey to safety was so important in terms of being able to break that intergenerational cycle. And one of the questions we asked on the parenting survey were questions that were asked on the Canadian National Longitudinal Study of Youth and Parenting. And there is an assumption that because women are being abused and going through a terrible crisis, they will be dysfunctional parents. And what we found, we did a quick look at the responses that these women gave about how they dealt with discipline, how they dealt with their children's behavior, corrected it. And the women in our sample who had these long and difficult experiences of abuse scored higher, better than the national average in terms of selecting positive, non-violent, non-humiliating forms of discipline. So, you know, if women can get out of these violent relationships or transform the violent relationship, the potential for the child is so positive. And that intergenerational cycle is something that we all, I think, need to work very hard on.
Do you want to just go down and just...
Oh, right, yes.
Oh,
Yes?
I'm speaking from Brisbane.
Yes.
One of the problems that we face in this area is an increasing number of responding women accompanied by a decreasing level of the amount of violence that has to be involved for them to have a protection order against them. Now, I was just wondering when you were talking about the diversion program and the criminal justice program, whether you're finding the same thing in Canada and how that would apply to women then in terms of the option for diversionary programs, or is it different in Canada?
Could you just repeat the beginning of it? You're saying that women are experiencing a decreasing...
Far more protection orders being taken out against women.
Oh, right. Okay, thank you.
Much less levels of violence needed for that to happen. So I found out he was cheating me. I slapped him across the face with enough for a protection order.
Well, in Canada, to get a protection order, if it was the husband, in this case, she was being protected, or he was being protected from her, he would have to apply for it. Like, the police don't apply for protection orders. They can't do that. It has to be the applicant who applies for it. So it would depend on whether their partner wanted to apply for a protection order. Where we had some concern, so we don't have a lot of cross orders. We have very, very few. What happens occasionally in Canada is a woman will apply for a protection order, and when her partner is given the paper telling him that he can no longer have contact and communication with her and he's under, this protection order, or he's being prohibited by the protection order, sometimes he will get very irritated and he'll go to the court and try to get a protection order against her, a retaliatory protection order. Those applications are almost always denied. They're very seldom. And there has to be very significant evidence that of a history of violence for him to be able to get a cross order. I'm not saying it doesn't occur. I'm just saying
is about to end in less than 5 minutes.
I'm just saying that it's much rarer. Where there was a lot of concern in Canada was about cross arrest. In other words, the police attend an incident and there's evidence of a lot of chaos in the home, you know, chairs turned over, maybe slap marks on faces, a lot of evidence. If the woman said, he hit me, and if he said, she hit me, there was a tendency sometimes for the police to arrest both of them. Now, we lobbied very hard for our municipal police to develop a program in their training to identify the primary aggressor, so that if a woman was defensively violent, she wouldn't be the person you arrest. When we brought in the pro-arrest policy, we saw the number of cases of dual arrest rise from about 4 to 8%. And then we started lobbying very hard with the police department. But what really made the difference is a woman who was cross-charged and arrested, sued the city, she won, and the police immediately implemented the policy. And now we have a very small percentage, about 3% of all the people who are arrested now involve dual arrests. So if you have clients who are suffering that way, there's nothing like a lawsuit to bring attention to the authorities. Not that I'm encouraging it, but
Thinking again from Townsville.
yes.
I find that in certain areas, Indigenous women are not reporting violence because their aim is to get their men fixed up, not incarcerated, because then they are left with so many children to care for. They just want the man fixed up, and I think that's really the objective, is to make the family work. So many of the women are not reporting because they just want the man fixed up. They don't want him in jail.
Yeah. That's certainly a concern that Aboriginal women in Canada express, because of course they have a long and terrible history with the criminal justice system in Canada. However, what we're finding, and that's a really excellent question, because there's a huge dilemma in our country. On the one hand, if they don't call the police, they have to continue to endure it because they don't have a lot of resources. As you saw, they don't have a lot of money. They can't, you know, just flee and go off to another city. Like they're very limited in their options. So in Canada, if you look at who primarily calls the police, Aboriginal women call police in Canada more often than non-Aboriginal women. And the issue is they want that immediate protection for themselves and their children. Now, you're absolutely right. In many, many cases, they don't want their partner to go to jail. They don't necessarily want their partner even to be convicted. But they're using the police response as a way of interrupting, stopping an escalating pattern of violence. And because we have a specialist court and because we have specialist prosecutors, they're very sensitive to that reality. If the victim doesn't want to testify, they can't force her to testify. And one of the things that they've introduced, which I think is quite creative on the part of our prosecutors, is they will meet with the woman after she's spoken to the victim services staff and say, well, what outcome do you want? And of course, what they say is, I want the violence to stop. I don't want to break up the family. I don't want him in jail. I want the violence to stop. And so sometimes the prosecutors will do testimony bargaining rather than plea bargaining. And they'll say to the woman, well, if I were to only proceed on the less serious charges, and if I were to be able to recommend with the defense lawyer that he receive court-mandated treatment, would you be willing to testify? And they might say, well, that sounds like a reasonable option. The prosecutor then immediately phones the defense lawyer, says, I have I have a witness, and what happens is more often than not, he pleads guilty, and they come forward with a recommended sentence of supervised probation and treatment. So there are ways. Whoops. Okay, so are there any questions here? Because sorry, it's very, I felt like I had to talk so fast. So yes.
You reported on health impacts on women, and that was a self-reported questionnaire. Did you do any checking through any other medical reporting against that? You did it with...
No, in Canada, we have a Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, and so all individuals' health records are private, and the only way we could have access to them is if the woman agreed for us to have access. But considering the magnitude and size of the study, we just couldn't do it. However, I can certainly tell you, among many of the women that I interviewed, you could see the evidence of their health impact. Serious joint problems, serious problems with alcohol and drug dependency, serious problems with depression. So we really felt fairly confident that what women were telling us was, so we didn't feel the need to check up on them, actually.
Yeah. I was just wondering, when it comes to women with disabilities, are you actually talking in the context of women with physical disabilities only, or have you included actually women with like cognitive disabilities, psychological, mental illness?
Well, in terms of how we selected our sample, the one thing we screened for is if women had a severe mental illness and as a result of that wouldn't necessarily be able to give truly informed consent, we would exclude them for ethical reasons, and also a concern that they might also have difficulty, if they were on a lot of drugs, they might have difficulty remembering and being able to attend to the responses. So when we specifically recruited for women with disabilities, they tended to be physical disabilities, but also things like depression, where they would, it was a mental illness, but not one that would affect their ability to give consent or their ability to remember. But I would say probably it's biased in terms of our recruitment towards women with physical disabilities. When we actually got everyone in the sample, we found a large number of women who weren't specifically recruited as having a disability who did because of the abuse, and those were that 1/3 that I demonstrated in the slide.
Jane, I want to sincerely thank you for such a clear and excellent presentation. Looking forward to the not so preliminary findings, and particularly that data that you get to about the differences between the Aboriginal and the non-Aboriginal women's experiences, and what their expectations were going into the criminal justice system and how that informed those responses. So I'm very much looking forward to that. Please join me in thanking Jane very much.